The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have had weeks and weeks of Donald Trump saying, James Comey told me I wasn't personally under investigation. He said it once, he said it twice, he said it 3 times, according to Donald Trump. And James Comey did confirm at his testimony last week that at a particular point in time, months ago, that was true. Trump was not under investigation. And now, you must know where I'm going with this. Coinciding with Donald Trump's 71st birthday, we've learned that Donald Trump is under personal investigation for obstruction by special prosecutor Robert Muller. And this is sort of getting lost in the never-ending constant sequence of news. This is arguably the biggest news on the Russia scandal in quite some time. And of course, Donald Trump is calling it fake. Officials are saying that special prosecutor Robert Mueller's investigation into Russia and Trump collusion now includes looking at Donald Trump personally for possible obstruction of justice. The president of the United States is personally being investigated. And this investigation is, in some way, shape, or form, about a year old at this point. And rather than shrinking, Pat, it is growing. It is growing with every bit of news that we get. And now it personally includes the president of the United States. This does not change or contradict that James Comey told Trump months ago that he was not under investigation. At the time, that was presumably true. James Comey is no longer in charge. Months have passed, and now Donald Trump is under investigation. And 5 people briefed on the interview requests that have been out there so far related to this, speaking on the condition of anonymity because they weren't authorized to actually discuss this, are saying that Daniel Coates, current director of national intelligence, Admiral Mike Rogers, head of the NSA, and Rogers's recently departed deputy, Richard Legett, have agreed to be interviewed by Robert Mueller as early as this week.
And really, this idea that Trump wasn't personally being investigated was bogus to begin with, because, of course, his campaign was being investigated. And who's at the head of the campaign? The candidate, Donald Trump.
Yeah, so while technically speaking, it appears to have been true that at a certain point Trump wasn't being looked at as an individual, he was, of course, part of the broader investigation into his campaign. Now, what's the response from Donald Trump's lawyer, Mark Kasowitz? No surprise. Focus on the fact that this was leaked rather than the substance. Par for the course. A quote from Mark Corallo, who's a spokesman for Trump's attorney, Mark Kasowitz, said, "The FBI leak of information regarding the president is outrageous, inexcusable, and illegal." Donald Trump's comments on the matter, they came at 6:55 a.m. this morning via Twitter, naturally, saying, quote, "They made up a phony collusion with the Russian story, found 0 proof, so now they go for obstruction of justice on the phony story. Nice." Also adding via Twitter, "You were witnessing the single greatest witch hunt in American political history, led by some very bad and conflicted people. Hashtag make America great again." Given how concerned Donald Trump has been for months as to whether or not he was personally under investigation, it's hard for me to imagine, Pat, that he's taking this news particularly well. And remember, Comey warned him. Comey was asked by Donald Trump in one of those Oval Office meetings, "Can you go out there and say that I'm not under investigation?" And James Comey said, "Listen, you should think about whether you want me to do that, because once you do that, you are, number one, putting that conversation into the public, and you are creating a duty to correct, where if I go out there as FBI director, per James Comey, and say Trump is not under investigation personally, if that were to change at some point in the future, Comey would then have a duty to correct that and say, those circumstances have changed. Exactly what Comey warned Trump about is what is happening.
And that had to do with the collusion angle. Now we're approaching this obstruction of justice angle.
Yep.
And Chris Ruddy, who's one of Trump's close friends, say that he's floating the idea of firing special counsel Robert Mueller.
That's right.
If that was to happen, I think the trains would fall off.
Trains off the rails, the paintings falling off the wall, the you-know-what hitting the fan.
Whatever analogy you want
Whatever
to use.
analogy you want to use is what would take place. But I don't want to get hyperbolic. We all need to remember that even if evidence of crimes is found against Donald Trump, this is very complex because the Justice Department has held for a very long time, not just under Donald Trump, that it would be incredibly difficult, if even potentially inappropriate, to indict a sitting president. It would depend on Congress to look at the evidence and say, this evidence warrants starting impeachment proceedings. And if that happens, Republicans would find themselves in a very complex situation. Complex in the sense that they'll be thinking of their own reelection chances. Morally, if you're a sensible elected official and an ethical elected official, and you're presented with evidence of criminality by the president, you say impeach regardless of party. Republicans, like most elected officials, it's not that Democrats are different, would have to decide what's worse: impeaching a president from my own party or ignoring the potential crimes of a president of my own party. The answer will likely depend on Trump's approval rating at the time and how close we are to a re-election campaign.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that if the House was to impeach Trump, then it would be, of course, up to the Senate to convict.
Right.
And the Senate, in that case, is supposed to act as if they're a jury. And usually when you select a jury, you choose people who are going to be impartial and not aware of everything.
Not
That's
exactly
really
going to
in
happen,
this, Senate.
No doubt about that. We are living in fascinating times. Trump, personally, under investigation now. Yesterday, we covered the hearing of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and his testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I talked about this technique that Jeff Sessions used when he didn't want to answer questions about Trump. He would say, so technique one was, I don't remember, I don't recall, I've forgotten what I remembered to not know about initially, if it ever happened, but what I can assure you is I never did anything wrong. That was technique number one. Technique number two was he would say, well, I want to respect the right of Donald Trump to, at some future point, maybe invoke executive privilege if he wants to, which didn't really make any sense because, as I told you yesterday, during hearings, the president has what's called executive privilege. If the president is testifying and he's asked about something, he can invoke executive privilege to avoid talking about certain things, serious things, as Donald Trump likes to say, including what he might consider to have been a confidential conversation between him and someone else. This can also be invoked by the president when other people are testifying, like Jeff Sessions, to conversations that they may have had with the president. Trump did not invoke executive privilege with regard to anything that Jeff Sessions was asked about on Monday or Tuesday, I guess it was. So Sessions was expected to answer questions that he was asked. Basically, every single time Sessions was asked about past conversations with Trump, he refused to answer because he was preserving Donald Trump's right to invoke executive privilege, maybe in the future, retroactively, if he wanted, which is not how executive privilege works. Sessions said it was a Department of Justice policy not to testify about conversations with the president, but when he was asked whether it's an actual rule, he didn't actually explain whether it was or wasn't. Here's just a clip of what went on at that hearing.
Senator, I'm protecting the president's constitutional right by not giving it away before he has a chance to view it. And secondly, I am telling the truth in answering your question in saying it's a long-standing policy of the Department of Justice.
Are those policies written?
Even and to make sure the president has full opportunity to decide these issues.
Can you share those policies with us? Are they written down at the Department of Justice?
I believe they are.
This is the appropriateness legal standard for not answering congressional inquiries.
It's my judgment that it would be inappropriate for me to answer and reveal private conversations with the president when he has not had a full opportunity to review the questions and to make a decision on whether or not to approve such an answer. One, there are also other privileges that could be invoked.
Sessions was there to talk about things related to Trump. That was the point of the hearing. Total gong show. And Jeff Sessions was trying to have it both ways. He was saying, I don't have the right to invoke executive privilege in order not to answer your question. And the president hasn't invoked executive privilege to prevent me from answering your question. But I'm going to refuse in the hypothetical case that Trump would have seen the questions ahead of time and might want to retroactively invoke executive privilege.
And it's not the case that Trump didn't have the opportunity to invoke executive privilege. This hearing was on the books for a little while.
Yeah.
I mean, if you got to make a decision and people are going to make assumptions and their own decisions based off of your decisions.
Of course.
So this doesn't really work.
And endless legal experts have said Jeff Sessions has no idea what he's talking about. Start with Asha Rangappa, Associate Dean at Yale Law School, who said executive privilege, even if it applies in this case, can only be invoked by the president. Sessions cannot preemptively invoke it on the president's behalf. Second, I'm not sure what Department of Justice policy has to do with this. DOJ policy is an internal executive branch regulation. It does not provide a legal shield against testifying in Congress when it is conducting an investigation as part of its oversight function. Basically saying whether or not the policy was written down, as Jeff Sessions seemed unable to answer, it doesn't matter because it is not legally relevant to this type of testimony. Then we heard from Lisa Kern Griffin, law professor at Duke University, who said Sessions used the invocation of vague principles of confidentiality to his advantage. That's not how it works. In fact, General Sessions carefully avoided the phrase executive privilege and kept referring to confidentiality. This is similar to what occurred during the testimony of Admiral Rogers and Director of National Intelligence Coates. Lisa Kern also said that legally speaking, Sessions could be held in contempt of Congress for this. That's not going to happen. I don't think we have to really worry about that. But again, something that could happen. And also concurring with this were Samuel Gross, a law professor at University of Michigan, Diane Marie Ammon, law professor at the University of Georgia. All legal experts asked about this, Pat, said this is bogus.
Right, because Jeff Sessions not only swore to tell the truth, he also swore to tell the whole truth.
That's exactly
the problem here,
right.
as we talked about yesterday, though, is it's hard to prove whether or not someone forgot or was able to remember something.
Very difficult to prove that legally. And here is Senator Heinrich talking to Aaron Burnett after the hearing about what happened.
Did you walk away from this trusting him more or not? That's the bottom line.
I walked away from this being highly concerned that there now seems to be a concerted effort by the administration to obstruct this investigation.
And so you think he was obstructing and impeding today, the Attorney General of the United States?
He wouldn't answer the most basic questions under oath, and we're not going to be able to get to the bottom of this entire matter unless we have honest answers from the administration.
There it is. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Mark Plunkett. Mark is a great David Pakman Show member who has also helped us out with some graphical elements, including the great graphic with our logo and a globe that scrolls over my right shoulder during the TV show and YouTube show. Thank you, Mark, for being a David Pakman Show member. You can join Mark in support of our program at davidpakman.com/membership. Coupon code available, I voted 17. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And lastly, if you are someone who sometimes shops on Amazon.com, the shopping you do can support us if you go to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop. I was on the David Pakman Show Reddit discussion forum this morning at davidpakman.com/Reddit. Thought I would point out some interesting conversations that are taking place to you, hoping that you will join the discussion there. Let's start with a post about Mike Pence being better than Donald Trump because he is medically sane and functioning and more competent than Donald Trump. And a whole conversation started about if it were Pence instead of Trump who was ultimately leading the country, what would be the pros and cons? Very, very good conversation going on there. Also this morning on the Reddit discussion forum, a discussion about Oliver Stone's new multi-part interview conducted over several years with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. And I saw a preview of that, Pat. It looks fascinating. Oliver Stone driving around with Vladimir Putin and I have not seen it yet. It's on, I think, Showtime. I don't get Showtime, so I'm going to have to figure out how to watch that. But it looks very, very interesting.
And it looks as if Oliver Stone gave an interview about the interview he had with Vladimir Putin on
Stephen
the Late
Colbert.
Show with Stephen Colbert.
That's exactly right.
I'm a big Stephen Colbert guy.
Well, there you go. We'll note that for the future. And now we know that you're a big fan.
Are you a Jimmy Fallon guy?
I don't really watch any of those shows.
Okay.
I'm not up late enough. Although I know I could watch it later, the next day, whatever. Okay, already also on our Reddit discussion forum, why is there little talk about the social conservatism within the Black community? A very interesting conversation about something that I have talked about before, social conservatism in the Black community. Interesting discussion. From our Reddit discussion forum, people angry that Pat downplayed resistance to Donald Trump from the UK. Pat said that there was a petition which garnered 600,000 signatures to keep Trump from coming to the UK. In reality, that petition garnered 1.8 million signatures. So, yeah. Pat, you were wrong, but that only made your point stronger.
Right. No, I don't think I was wrong, because it did get 600,000 signatures.
It just got way more than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Only by a factor of 3.
You weren't wrong. You were only talking about the first 600,000 signatures. Yeah. And lastly, from the Reddit discussion forum, another one of these odd still images of me during YouTube live streams. And I can't really describe it, so if you're listening to me, you're just going to have to check out the video clip.
It's not safe for work.
It's not safe for work, that's for sure. DavidPakman.com/Reddit. Please visit our Reddit discussion forum. There are now nearly 4,000 of our viewers and listeners, Pat, who are participating in discussions on the Reddit discussion forum. And for that, I think we can all be glad.
Yeah.
All right. Pat's glad. Pat seems entertained by something that's going on. I don't really know what. We'll have to talk about that later. Okay. Results from the non-scientific poll at davidpakman.com. I'm going to give you poll results that answer the question, is Donald Trump untouchable no matter what he does? Now, before you start emailing me saying, David, this is a fake poll, it's not scientific, whatever. This is not a scientific poll. This is a poll reflective only of the portion of our audience that chose to go to davidpakman.com and vote, meaning there is self-selection bias, there is a sample that is not representative of the entire country. It's just what our audience thinks. Mm-hmm. Let's put up the results, Pat. Is Donald Trump untouchable no matter what he does? 70% of our audience who chose to participate says no, Donald Trump's misdeeds will catch up with him. 16% of our audience believes that Donald Trump is mostly untouchable unless he personally murders someone, a reference to shooting people on Fifth Avenue. 7% of our audience believes that Donald Trump is indeed totally untouchable no matter what he does. And 7% of our audience sort of isn't sure. I tend to be in the Trump is mostly untouchable camp, not necessarily with the only exception being if he murders someone. But I think Trump has already gotten away with so much that he will not ultimately face consequences for, that I lean towards Trump being by and large untouchable with the exception of something really major.
He's also been underestimated so many times. People say he wouldn't run, and then he ran, and then he wouldn't win the primaries. He won the primaries, and then he wouldn't be president, and then he was president. Hard to deny that. And
now we're saying he's not going to build the wall and make Mexico pay for it and blah, 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 blah. But maybe he will. Maybe he will. Although most people actually, I saw a poll, an actual scientific poll, unlike the ones on our website. Only 36% of Americans seem to want the wall built, according to Gallup.
Another point on this, too, I think, everything sticks to him for the 65% of Americans who don't really like the job that he's doing.
Fair enough.
But nothing sticks to him to the 35% who approve.
Yeah, the very, very good point. New poll at davidpakman.com. Results next week. What is your opinion of Megyn Kelly's decision to interview conspiracy theorist Alex Jones on her new network TV show? That's the current poll at davidpakman.com. Vote, and we will have results next week. We have done plenty of stories, Pat, about small numbers of people owning ridiculous portions of the world's wealth. Last year, it was reported that there were 8 men who owned what was equal to the wealth of about half the world's population. Last year, it was reported that 6 men owned an amount of wealth equivalent to the poorest half of the world's population. As of this month, 5 men own almost as much wealth as half the world's population. This is a story about worsening inequality. This is a story about a situation, a status quo, that is really bad for the economy. And this is all based on a new Oxfam study of data from all of 2016, the poorest 50% of the world's population owns about $410 billion in total wealth. And as of June 8th of this year, 5 men collectively own more than $400 billion in wealth, roughly the same. On average, each of those men owns as much wealth as 750 million people. The American economic system and the wealth inequality that it produces are a major part of the problem. In 2016 alone, the richest 1% of Americans shifted nearly $4 trillion in wealth away from the rest of the country. Half of that wealth came from the poorest 90% of the United States. And when we hear from the right, Pat, and the supply-siders and the voodoo economics supporters, or whatever you want to call them, they say we're against redistribution of wealth. We don't want welfare because it redistributes from the rich to the poor. We don't want mandates for health insurance because it redistributes subsidies from the rich to the poor. What we are seeing in terms of our fundamental economic system and the stock market, as we've talked about with economist Richard Wolff, is redistribution of wealth, but the opposite way, from the poor to the rich. And the 1%ers generally don't seem to have a problem with that.
Yeah, and they seem to get a pass on it, too, because, of course, with all that money, you can do a lot of good. So you have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Sure.
You have these great charitable works that they do.
So some people will hear what I say, and they'll say, well, but David, this is good news. America's the best. We've got the best rich people, truly tremendous rich people in our country. This is not a good thing, as Pat is pointing out. But forget about it being bad morally. That's very subjective. It's bad economically, and it's bad for everyone. You need, for business to function, you want the largest number of people possible able to afford the goods and services produced by those businesses. When you see this redistribution of wealth to the top 1% or higher, you end up with fewer people able to afford to go out and buy stuff. Not to mention that it is widely known that at a purely technical level, inequality leads to more criminality. And from an economic standpoint, more criminality is not good for the economy. When you have to invest money in enforcing the law because more people are committing crimes, that's also not a good thing economically.
And the irony here is that it's perhaps in the best interest of the rich to support social programs and some sort of progressive tax rate, because if there's inequality to an extent that it creates some sort of unrest, that's not going to be very good for them. I mean, you have to support things, maybe even the future, like a universal basic income.
It's obvious. And being exposed to the wealth inequality that exists is only going to exacerbate what Pat is talking about. So we've got wealth inequality continuing to grow in the U.S. We've got American children now with a lower average quality of life compared to their parents, according to a April 2017 study from Harvard, Stanford, and Berkeley. And the healthy diet divide in the United States is growing too. The diets of people with higher incomes are getting better, while people at the bottom are less and less able to afford healthy food, based on a recent study that uses the American Heart Association's guidelines to define healthy food. There are those who will hear all of this and say, David, we live in a meritocracy. People deserve the money that they have, and people have the money that they deserve because of what they produce for society. That's not true either. The truth is that a great deal of those in the 1% are involved with finance, the financial services industry, and they are producing nothing. And I'm not saying that to be insulting, Pat. I'm not saying these are bad people. I have many friends in that industry. Economic study after economic study has determined that the fruits of the financial industry in terms of the benefits to the economy at large are almost nothing in terms of what they are providing to the economy. They are by and large enriching the people in the industry at the expense of those who are disadvantaged by this upward redistribution of wealth.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that the richest of the rich deserve everything that they have because they're all self-made and they earned it isn't necessarily true when you have families like the Waltons who just inherited their wealth.
So the Waltons own half
or 40%?
40 to 50% of what the American economy is, the poorest half of the American economy. And then you've got these 5 men who own the same amount of wealth as the poorest 50% of the entire world. And many of the billionaires that we sometimes consider to be sort of like innovators are businessmen like, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. They get credit for creating technology that would have been created anyway, or were created partially through our tax dollars, through corporate subsidies, through universities, et cetera. And this is not to take away from their success in any way, but the idea that they are self-made completely independently of the commons and of shared resources and of taxpayer money, you're living in a fantasy world if that's what you believe. So we need reform in a number of ways. We need tax fairness. We need to really go after these attempts from particularly Republicans in the House and Senate to gut regulations like Dodd-Frank, which will further empower Wall Street. We need more oversight for financial markets in general, probably a stronger Volcker rule as well, enlarging the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And if the private market is failing to provide jobs and growth, and the job market is suffering, why wouldn't the government apply monetary and fiscal policies that would help to bolster employment? And we could go on, and I've talked about it for a while. Where are Democrats on a lot of these issues? We hear almost nothing from too many Democrats, the pathetic corporate Democrats who are not out there every day talking about we've got to get health care for everybody. People need to stop making employment decisions based on losing health care, for example. I could go on and on. I don't want to go off on a tangent, Pat, but Democrats have got to get it together. And part of this is Democrats were elected by the same status quo that Republicans were elected.
Yeah, and another part of this, too, is some of the richest of the rich support Democrats. You have people like Michael Bloomberg or Warren Buffett who are somewhat liberal. That's
good. And it's good to point that out because we need to understand that it's not just Republicans are the rich and the rich are for Republicans, but also that on many issues, including those of how politics are financed, we've got to be criticizing Democrats as much as we're criticizing Republicans, or almost as much if that's what they deserve. And by and large, it is. Talk about this with us on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/Reddit.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Kory Stamper, who's a lexicographer at Merriam-Webster, where she also writes, edits, and appears in the Ask the Editor video series. Her recent book, Word by Word, is now available in bookstores. Kory, it's so great to have you. I think just at sort of the top level, I think the number one question the audience wrote in about that they wanted to hear an answer to was, is there some standard barometer for deciding when a word merits inclusion in the Merriam-Webster dictionary?
Well, we do have criteria for entry, though they slide around a little bit because it just depends on which dictionary you're defining for, what the word is. So the main criteria are a word has to have widespread use, so use in lots of different places geographically and tonally. It needs to have sustained use, so it needs to have fully entered the language, not just sort of pop up here and there once every 20 years. And it needs to have meaningful use, so it has to have a meaning that lexicographers can actually grab from context. So no nonsense words or no examples of really long words. So those are the basic criteria. The way that you decide whether a word has met that criteria for the book, that's sort of where the art of lexicography comes in. You get a sense as to how long the sustained use needs to be or how widespread the use needs to be the longer you do this job.
Is there often heated disagreement about whether a word should or shouldn't receive inclusion in the dictionary?
I don't know if I would say heated disagreement because we're all very quiet people. There are times when there is some disagreement about when a word should get in, when a word should be revised. But honestly, because we all have the same training and because we all sort of sit within this bell curve of Sprachgefühl, of a feeling for language, it's not as difficult to discern once you get into the weeds of it as you would think. There are times when people will send each other notes. That's how we argue. Notes or emails saying, this really should be in for the next copyright update, or we're late on adding this, we should add it. But we rarely disagree with each other.
Are there political considerations when deciding about whether a word should or shouldn't be in the dictionary? And when I say political, that could apply to, sort of like partisan politics as we know it, but also issues of political correctness, for example. I mean, are these issues that you contend with in deciding about whether a word should be in the dictionary?
Not so much in deciding on whether a word should be in the dictionary. That's a pretty basic data approach. But that does come into play when we're evaluating the raw material that we use in writing definitions. Lexicographers get very, very good at reading through political spin on all sides. They get very good at sort of gauging when someone is using a word and you hear a lot from one side or the other saying, well, that's a ridiculous word, you shouldn't enter it, or that's politically correct. You get very good at sort of filtering out the opinion and just coming right down to the word itself. And the great thing about online dictionaries is we can even write paragraphs saying, like, people object to this use because they see it as overly politicized, which we couldn't do in print dictionaries.
Well, along those lines, I mean, it seems like the definitions of words are what maybe lend themselves more to disagreement and bias or being politicized, right? You could probably have more agreement about the inclusion or exclusion of a word, but then choosing how that word is defined, that seems to me to be a little dicier.
It is, and I think it's also an ever-evolving process. Just like language outside of the dictionary office moves, so does the language that you use in writing a dictionary definition. I am working on updating some definitions from a dictionary that was published about 60 years ago. And a lot of the work that I'm doing and have been doing are things like degendering words and definitions that don't need to be gendered, making sure that there's parity in terms of if we enter chairman, we should also enter chairwoman. So those sorts of things back in the 50s when this dictionary was being edited, that was, it would be forward thinking to include the word chairwoman. Now it's just a given. So in terms of not necessarily the language that that gets in, but yeah, the language that gets used in definitions, that evolves just as much as the language that gets used in the world.
When we are defining words, and this would also apply to phrases, and I'll give an example, when can we say that the meaning has changed sort of due to common usage? And a good example that I can think of is the phrase to beg the question, right? Begging the question originally is a sort of logical fallacy where you're using the premise to support a conclusion. But now it's used colloquially, and I guess I would say incorrectly in some sense, by people to say, well, that raises the question, or it makes a particular question obvious, or puts it out in the forefront. It's not really what begging the question originally meant, but it's been misused so often that one could argue, and I'm starting to see it in some online dictionaries, that it's sort of like a secondary or tertiary meaning of that phrase. How do you figure something like that out? Like, when does it become correct to use it that way?
Well, the idea of what's correct and what's incorrect certainly varies from person to person. But within lexicography, if a new meaning meets those criterion or the criteria, then it's valid for entry. So beg the question. This is a great example. There are lots of people who say, this raise the question sense is wrong because it's not the original meaning. And that's true. But honestly, we have, decades and decades of edited, published prose where beg the question is used to mean raise the question. So at that point, it's not so much an issue of this is correct and this is incorrect and we keep the incorrect stuff out. The dictionary's approach is if it's used enough in print, someone is probably going to try and look it up at some point. And so we should enter it, whether people think it's correct or incorrect. And you can say, this sense of beg the question is considered incorrect by some people. And that's okay. But I think people see the dictionary as this sort of black and white, right and wrong authority. And so when the meanings of words change and the dictionary acknowledges that, they get very upset because they feel like the dictionary is abrogating its authority. but we're doing what we've always done, which is just to record the language as it's used.
Let me ask you about a controversy I was embroiled in a few months ago. I sort of offhandedly used the word irregardless, which, I mean, I think basically means the same thing as regardless. And I looked it up, and irregardless is a word, but I got a lot of email from people saying, David, you know, you really hurt your credibility when you said irregardless when talking about, you know, something related to the president or something like that.
Right.
Where are we right now on irregardless?
Irregardless, well, I should start by saying that in my book, I call myself America's foremost irregardless apologist. So this should set it up for you. I mean, irregardless is a word that's been around in print for over 200 years. And it has use in some dialects of English, usually rural dialects of English, as an intensive form of regardless. So you could say regardless of this and irregardless, we're doing blah, blah, blah. Now, the fact is that even though it's been in print for 200 years, it's still not a part of standard English, which is sort of the formal written English that we all aspire to in high school and in college. And because of that, if you use irregardless, people are going to say you're uneducated, that's not a word, it's illogical. They throw all of this at you. The fact is it is a word. It has plenty of use in speech. In fact, I've found evidence of irregardless in oral arguments of Supreme Court cases when Scalia was on the court and he didn't even correct it. So it's common in speech. It's not common in writing. So if you use it in writing or in more formal settings, people will call you out for it. But I think irregardless has merit, and I think it has use. It's just all about context, really.
Okay, for online speech, and really, I guess I mean online written language, is there sort of some medium between formal written English and spoken English that is sort of appropriate as a happy medium for when you're online on social media or Facebook or emails or whatever the case may be? Like, is there some convention developing as to what's appropriate there?
I think there is. Online communications are fascinating to lexicographers, particularly social media, because it is not necessarily outward facing, right? People sort of use Twitter like they would use a journal entry, but it's also not private correspondence. So people will use sort of much more informal or sort of in-group slang on Twitter that's outward facing than they will on their blog or in their writing. There is a convention that tends to be slightly more informal that is sort of being created on the internet. And frankly, that has even changed over the years. Some of the internet writing that we see now is much more formal than it used to be when it was, you know, back in the days of IRC. That's how old I am. Or back in the days of chat rooms or anything like that. So there is this really interesting register of English that's emerging online. And I don't know that I'd say it's settled into a convention yet, because it doesn't seem to have settled at all, but it's there. It is a real thing.
Kory, last thing before we let you go. What's sort of like the biggest controversy you've been involved in at Merriam-Webster? Like, what counts as a major upheaval or controversy in the dictionary world?
I think the answer to that would have to be when Merriam-Webster entered a second meaning of the word marriage that covered same-sex marriage. This was back in 2003, and which is actually kind of late, but it bucked against that idea of the dictionary being an authority, of the dictionary setting boundaries. And so it was about a solid month of, at that point I was the managing editor for correspondence, and that it was a solid month of just answering people's very angry emails about how can you do this? You are literally redefining marriage. The courts will look to the dictionaries to determine what marriage is.
Well, what's interesting about that, Kory, is in 2003 is when our home state of Massachusetts, I believe, legalized same-sex marriage. So if you're thinking of Merriam-Webster as an American dictionary, there were at that point places in America where marriage did include same-sex marriages.
Absolutely. And even if there hadn't been, even if same-sex marriage had continued to be illegal across states and illegal federally, it doesn't matter. We enter a lot of words for illegal acts in the dictionary. I mean, we enter murder, but we're not advocating that people go out and murder people. So, but it was this very interesting sort of, the dictionary mirroring what was already happening in the culture, and people responding as if the dictionary was leading the culture as opposed to reflecting it. So that's probably the biggest controversy I've been a part of.
Well, the book is fascinating. It's called Word by Word. It's in bookstores, and we've been speaking with the book's author, Kory Stamper. Kory, thanks so much for talking to us about this.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Well, Donald Trump's been cucked again, this time by the U.S. Senate, shockingly doing something right for once. I can't even say it seriously, and I know people write in and they say, David, you shouldn't use that word. I'm ridiculing the use of the word when I say it. I hope people understand that.
I'm undecided on the use of that word so far.
Fair enough. As we know, Donald Trump's administration started working on easing sanctions against Russia within hours of Donald Trump being sworn in on January 20th. And really, even before January 20th, unofficially, as we have since learned through such events as the resignation and shame of former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, the Senate is going against the Trump administration's attempts to ease Russian sanctions. They've overwhelmingly voted for a new set of sanctions against Russia specifically, to punish them for interfering in the 2016 election. They voted overwhelmingly, but not unanimously. The Senate voted 97-2 to approve the sanctions. Republicans Mike Lee and Rand Paul voted against approving those sanctions. Even Ted Cruz and Mitch McConnell, Freudian slip, guys. Mitch McConnell, excuse me. Wow. We have to just continue, right?
We have to keep going.
We'll edit that out. Don't worry about it. Maybe the most important element of this is that it takes away the authority from Donald Trump to unilaterally remove the sanctions that President Obama put in place. And that's a really good thing. NBC News on June 12th, 2017 reported that, quote, in a rebuke to the president, negotiators agreed that the additional sanctions on Russia would prohibit the president from being able to lift them without congressional approval. In addition, the measure would codify existing sanctions and place new economic restrictions in an effort to economically harm specific individuals and Russia's economy. But what will happen in the House? Unclear. The House is much more sympathetic to Trump than the Senate right now. The smart move by House Republicans would be never even vote on this, because if you vote on it and you're against it, you're putting yourself on the record as being against Russian sanctions. So if the House is not interested in this, Pat, their smartest move is never even bring up the matter in the first place.
Well, at least we are reaching consensus that Russia did indeed hack the election. I think that's step one. Even though 17 of our national intelligence agencies, even though Trump himself admits that Russia did hack the election, there's still people like Roger Stone and others who deny that.
And then from that, you have to say, well, if Obama put the sanctions in place because of something that we now believe to be true, why is it that we want to remove the sanctions? It doesn't really make sense. So the Senate doing the right thing, will it make a difference in the end? I don't know. Remember that Flint water crisis, the changing of the source of water in Flint, Michigan for financial reasons, which led to lead-tainted water, an absolute and total disaster. Couldn't drink it, weren't able to shower with it for a long time. This is still an issue. This is still going on. People's homes now, as we've previously reported, are being foreclosed upon because of failure to pay for their lead-tainted water. We now have learned that Michigan Attorney General Bill Schuette, I really don't know how he pronounces his last name. Anyway, the Michigan Attorney General has charged 5 water officials, including a member of Republican Governor Rick Snyder's cabinet and a former emergency manager, with manslaughter related to their alleged failure to act in the Flint water crisis. This is 5 individuals whose manslaughter charges are connected to the death of Robert Skidmore, who died in December of 2015. That's how long this has been going on. because of the Legionnaire's disease outbreak caused by the tainted water. On paper, involuntary manslaughter is a felony punishable by up to 15 years in prison and or, that key and or, a $7,500 fine. But don't get your hopes up, Pat. Pat's already writing down, waiting for the 15 years in prison. Don't get your hopes up about that, Pat. This is one of those situations where we're telling you the maximum possible penalty. I don't expect anybody to end up spending 15 years in prison for this. Although this is starting to rise, Pat, towards the Republican Governor Rick Snyder, who we still are sort of unsure how far implicated he was in this.
Rise like the water evaporating. You know, it's good to see that people in positions of power are actually going to face charges for this. You rarely see that.
Well, the counter from some is, David, listen, these were bureaucratic mistakes. This doesn't warrant criminal charges. There were mistakes, but there wasn't real criminal negligence or intent to hurt anybody. Not really true from the facts on the ground. I mean, one of the individuals here was aware of the Legionnaire's outbreak in early 2015. It took nearly a year for the public to be notified about that. That speaks to intent to deceive.
Right, and there certainly wasn't any malice here, but if there was malice, then that wouldn't be manslaughter, that would be murder.
That's a good point. Yeah, and when you could actually make the case that if it is as bad as it's been reported, manslaughter is not a stiff enough penalty. And documents that have been obtained indicate that at least one of the individuals involved here, quote, willfully disregarded the deadly nature of the Legionnaire's disease outbreak, later saying, we can't save everyone, and hey, everyone's got to die of something. That sounds straight up
somehow, you know?
That sounds straight up depraved.
Yeah.
And I always hesitate to say, oh, someone is evil or an institution is evil. It's often, you know, sort of lack of empowerment and indifference. But that straight up sounds like depravity. And this relates to a broader issue of infrastructure in our country. We've been talking for a while, Pat, about how infrastructure is a disaster and we need to be talking more loudly about infrastructure. But also, when Donald Trump talks about infrastructure, it's not this panacea that's going to make everything great. Trump's talking about infrastructure specifically with a plan to give cronyistic handouts to his friends and donors. It is not going to be the rescue of infrastructure. It's going to be a way to do some projects by enriching Trump's friends.
It's like bringing coal jobs back to West Virginia and privatizing air traffic control.
It's something that at the micro level, some people will be happy about, but big picture is by and large missing the systemic problems that we're dealing with in our country. It's pathetic and it's embarrassing, but I guess the good news here, let's try to focus on the silver lining, phrase of the decade. There are charges that have been brought, and now we will see if we are starting to get some justice for the people of Flint, Michigan. Okay, yesterday we had this voicemail from Troy York, and I expressed, you know, it seems a little sad that Troy York is living in a totally alternate reality. The Eggman is now commenting on the comments from Troy York and commenting about whether he feels bad for Troy York. Here's the Eggman. Take a listen.
Hey, I don't feel bad for Troy York. I feel bad for his pets, his kids, his wife. And meth lollipops, is that for when you really want to rot your teeth out?
Wow, I was waiting for the Eggman's typical sign-off with shalom, everybody. But he did not, no shalom that time. Okay, so listen, there are growing conflicts between frequent callers on the show.
You had asked me yesterday if I was jealous of Troy York because he just doesn't seem to know any better.
Like ignorance is bliss sort
Ignorance
of thing.
is bliss. And you asked, you know, would I take that deal, right? I don't think so. I'd rather be right than be happy.
All right. Well, listen, you're not necessarily, there are many people who don't agree with you fundamentally. And it's America. So we have
philosophical here on the show.
We have the freedom in America to be blissfully ignorant or informedly miserable. I don't know. I don't know what to call it.
I like it.
On the bonus show today, United Airlines is again apologizing, this time after a video from 2015 shows an employee pushing a 71-year-old passenger to the floor. Not good. I'm going to talk about the huge double standard when it comes to Senator Kamala Harris from California and her performance destroying the impotent arguments of Attorney General Jeff Sessions during the day before yesterday's testimony. We will also talk about New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, whose approval rating has gone down not to 35%, not to 30%, not to 25%, not to 20%, not to 19 or 18 or 17% or 16%. I will tell you on the bonus show just how low his approval rating has gone. It's not looking good for Chris Christie. DavidPakman.com/membership is how you get access to the bonus show. Sign up today, and we'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.